you know, it could go somewhere else. I think that would be a shame.
One question over Slido here from one anonymous questioner to the Prime Minister. Regarding the New World Order and the defense of Europe, do you consider the need to establish a Nordic nuclear deterrence?
No, there I think again, you know, if you think about the ambition of the Nordics and Scandinavians after 1945, they had ambitions in defense, in currency, in market, and on all of those areas it proved that it had to be either European or Euro-Atlantic. So for security it had to be Euro-Atlantic with NATO. With markets it ended up to be a European market, either European, the internal market membership or EEA. On currency, for some countries it is the euro, I mean for the bulk of countries. And the only area where we really moved ahead as Nordics was on passport-free travel, very important in the 1950s already. But I think there will be a discussion among Europeans and should be a discussion about the nuclear deterrent. But it has to be European and inside the logic of NATO. But obviously we have a NATO strategy which is very clear that the nuclear is a prime deterrent. But it is not Nordic. It is NATO and European.
If I may add to this, this is also the sign of you know, our times, that you know, that we have this thinking when it comes to a lot of countries in the world, that whether we need a nuclear weapon, which is very dangerous development, because so far, you know, it was the non-proliferation and it was in everybody's interest, really. But now, and it started with Russia's war, because then a lot of countries saw that actually threatening with the nuclear weapon works. You get to walk away with what you want. Yeah. And okay, so there's a thinking, you know, all those countries who have appetite for their neighbors' territories is like, okay, we should have a nuclear weapon because then we get what we want. And all those countries who are afraid of their neighbors think that, you know, this is the only thing that works, so we should have a nuclear weapon. And I think, you know, in terms of the world order, this is a very dangerous development.
Exactly. Time is running. I would like to end with the main security threat in Europe. That's Ukraine. It's Russia's war against Ukraine. It's going into its 5th year this February. What is the path forward for the European Union to support Ukraine? And what role can Europe play in the future of some kind of peace process? I think that so far we have been very reactive to what's coming out of Washington. Should we be more in taking an initiative? It's a terrible war. We have to end it.
Well, we had this discussion in the morning as well. Now, the problem is that what we see right now is that you know, there has been a lot of push on Ukrainians to make very difficult concessions, which they are willing to do because they really want this war to stop. Now, this is blurring the picture from where the problem actually lies. If you think, you know, last 100 years, Russia has attacked at least 19 countries, some as many as 3 or 4 times. None of those countries has ever attacked Russia. So the question is how we make sure that this war does not continue or go anywhere else. So we need to see concessions on the Russian side, on limitations on their military budget, on their army, all these things, or nuclear weapons. Yep. So that to take this threat really away, plus the accountability for the crimes that they have committed. Now, there's no talk about this. Now, of course, the Russians see that why should they talk to the Europeans if, you know, talking to the Americans is delivering them the maximalist demands that they haven't even conquered militarily. So if we say that, you know, you should talk to us because we want you to make concessions, I mean, why should they? So I think, you know, in the peace process, we have a very clear role because what we have seen is that, you know, you can agree whatever, but if Europe is not agreeing to this, you need Europe on board, because then it also works. We need to think about the life after as well. We were discussing before, and really to you know, what is our approach right now is that we need to put more pressure on Russia so that they would go from pretending to negotiate to actually negotiate. And that's what we are doing, because otherwise, you know, we don't have actually a choice. And supporting Ukraine, of course.
Stoere, a last word on
Well, I mean, because geography matters, you know, the day this war is over and it has to end, I think the Ukrainians will keep fighting, because they are not likely to lie down, and we should support them with military means. We should support them with energy. We should support them diplomatically. But the day it ends, it will still be Europe.
Yeah.
Don't forget. And that is why, you know, how we build the economic development plan. And think about, you know, the generations of Ukrainians who will be affected by this. There are 4.5 million refugees. 100,000 of them in Norway. So, you know, and all of these are European tasks, and it will be big time issues for us to solve. So we have to keep our focus.
Thank you so much, Prime Minister and High Representative Kallas, for your time.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye. And while they are leaving, it is my great pleasure to invite to the stage Deputy Secretary General of NATO, Radmila Shekerinska. Please, Shekerinska. The floor is yours. Do you want to stand there? Okay. I will join you in a minute.
Good morning, and it's great to follow this very interesting, very honest and very open discussion. And it gives me really a great pleasure to be for the first time within this building. I remember visiting Norway many years ago. I was still a student, if I remember correctly. And as part of a Norwegian support program towards Central and Eastern Europe, I was invited here as one of the young leaders from the then Social Democratic Youth of Macedonia to join you for a program at Utøya. And it was a transformative experience because going through the many different elements of the Norwegian model, I have been confirmed in my views that politics can be a noble profession, that we can achieve more if we show more solidarity, if we search for the right answers to our joint problems. And I always say that it is because of Norway that I actually became involved very actively and chose politics as my profession. So in my both good and bad days in politics, and my friends here know that there are plenty of both, I do thank and blame Norway for it very often. But let me say, I was invited here to talk about one of the most important challenges and questions of today, and this is how do we see transatlantic relations in the future. And let me share, we have had the beginning of this discussion initially by the Prime Minister and the High Representative, but let me kick up the discussion with a few observations from where I stand in NATO. First, transatlantic relations were, are, and will be a result of hard work, but also shared interests and political will. And this has always been the case. Sometimes it's more visible, sometimes it's less visible, but you need all these elements to make these transatlantic relations work and be productive for all. For over 3/4 of a century, NATO has been able to provide its key goal, and this is to give security for 1 billion people across the alliance. And what is more important, we do agree on what is needed in order to deliver this shared goal. More defense investments, more defense production at a speedier scale, and also more support to Ukraine. And thank you for also raising this issue. It is clear that in this moment we do have the political will to make these three things happen. And I will tell you, last year, more or less this time of the year, I was in Sweden for their security conference. I was also in Vilnius for their snow conference. And if someone would have asked any of us, not just me, any of us there, would it be feasible for all 32 allies to agree not on a 2.5, not on a 3 or 3, on 5% of GDP defense investment pledge, most of us would have said no. Because let us not forget, even in 2025, it was still a challenge to have all allies at 2%, on which we have agreed more than 10 years ago. So still, we did. At the Hague Summit, we have managed to convince all and to have everyone on board to invest up to 5% of GDP until 2035, and this is our direction of travel. If you would have asked us, and even these people who are very active in defense production, will we be able to turn the tide when it comes to scaling up production, speeding up defense production? Many people probably would have been also less optimistic. But it is clear that the demand signal that was sent by the political leaders in The Hague, the fact that we have started interacting with defense industry in a regular, predictable, and very open discussion, did change the course. And what we have seen is that the defense industry across the alliance is already picking up pace, producing more firepower. We see this especially when it comes to ammunition, which was a source of great disappointment, that the fact that we couldn't produce not only as much as Russia, but actually 4 times less than Russia. This has changed dramatically in the course of 1 year, and we see this together with adopting latest technologies as a key element to change the developments, to change the curve. So don't get me wrong, we are not naive and we shouldn't be. We still have a lot to do. A commitment to spend and invest more is still commitment. Some of the countries are paving the way towards 5% at a much more ambitious timescale, but some are still taking their time. But it is clear that both leaders and defense industry know that we cannot stick to the old normal. We have to invest in our security because our security is challenged. And within our deterrence, we need to incorporate the defense industry, because if there is one very clear lesson from Ukraine, is that your pace of production and your industry and your innovation are as important as your political will to fight, as your military might and your command and control. We have also been clear about stepping up support to Ukraine. And I'm saying this here in Norway, and I want to stress that it is allies like Norway that have made this possible. By being active on all fronts, not just supporting Ukraine politically, but also supporting humanitarian needs, supporting issues such as energy security, which has become the big crisis now in Ukraine, but also being very clear in supporting them with military means. And I know that in the course of the last now 5th year, we have seen ups and downs, but Norway's commitment was really exemplary. And thank you for doing this, and thank you for pushing also other allies into doing the same. So we have come in a situation in which we see what is happening in Ukraine as also lessons learned of what are the wars of tomorrow. And by having your defense industry supporting them, by having all of us supporting their military capabilities, but also their training, their intelligence, we are also supporting our own deterrence and defense. And I don't think that we can repeat this message enough. This leads me to my second point, and this is that strong Atlantic relations demand that we sometimes have to work through our differences. And this is where the hard work comes. And I think your Prime Minister was very clear in saying that this is an approach that works. We are democracies. We have debates within our societies. We should not take them for granted. We also have dialogue with different allies. And sometimes, like in history, we have different points of view. And the big advantage is that the DNA of this alliance is about discussing and finding a way out and coming up with a solution that matches our shared interests for security. So we have, as part of this also discussion lately, we have come up with a U-turn when it comes to Arctic security. And several things were already mentioned, but I will just add that it was through the intelligence and the information from allies such as Norway, we have seen that across the Arctic we do see more interest and more presence by Russia. They have created their Arctic command. They have reopened some old military sites. They are creating new ones, basically deep water ports, but also airfields. They're testing their novel weapons in the Arctic. And this calls for our attention. And it became clear that it was not only Norway, and it was not just our Arctic allies that have the interest to preserve security, stability, and cooperation in the High North. It is in the interest of all NATO allies. And this is why we have agreed that we will do more, without focusing on just one part of the Arctic, but really looking at the Arctic as an area where we have to be strategically present and we have to protect our interests. And we have seen that allies are procuring more capabilities that are appropriate for our presence in the High North. Our troops are exercising in Arctic conditions, and this is where Norway comes as a leader. So last October, we opened a new center in Bodø that focuses on these issues, and with the exercise this March, this will be a very clear signal, not only of your contributions, of the importance of the Arctic, but as was mentioned, the importance of transatlantic unity. So transatlantic relations may be tested, and they are always tested, but we always come up with the alliance being stronger. Which brings me to my third and final observation, that the bond between Europe and North America remains the only really winning way in developing our security in a more dangerous and less predictable world. US security, US troops, US military might is indispensable for European security, but it goes both ways. It is also what Europeans, what we bring to the table, remains relevant from the Arctic to the Atlantic and towards US and Canada's security. So in this way, this is the bond that has kept our two continents together, and this is a bond that has made all of us more secure. For Europe and Canada to step up on defense investment is not a question of choice. It is a question of necessity. And this has been the case for quite some time. But it is true that the time when we could, some would say conveniently, give up on focusing on security and allow the US to deal with it is over. And this is a much more just and more stable arrangement in which not only US, but also Canada and European allies contribute in a meaningful way to our Euro-Atlantic security. This is why when we did our last polls, 81% of allied citizens, on average, throughout the alliance, consider the transatlantic bond as crucial for our shared security. And we have these expectations to take into account, but we also have some lessons, good and bad, from the more than 75 years of history. And this is why we do believe that, especially in challenging times, we will be able to deliver more security, but also more cooperation in a very, very hostile and unpredictable world. Thank you.
Thank you so much for pointing out the importance of the transatlantic bond and how we can strengthen in these turbulent times. It is a result of hard work, shared interest, and political will, as you said in your remarks. However, we have to reflect on the last week's remarks from Donald Trump and the tough diplomacy around Greenland, and his rather harsh rhetoric to European allies and Canada of being weak. How much has this harmed the trust among the allies? Could you tell a little bit from the headquarters? And how can we heal it?
Well, I remember reading, your Prime Minister mentioned, the days of university work and how I remember some of my university lessons that spoke about what is the basis and the strength of alliances in history and in the world. Is it a threat or is it trust? Yeah. And in my view, it has to be both. Yeah. We do share the common goal of providing security, and we have to also work on this with the appropriate level of trust. And I have to say that trust goes both ways. Yeah. But it is true that for many years, actually decades, as Europeans, we got used to US carrying most of the burden in an unacceptable way, maybe acceptable after the Second World War, but practically this has been the source of frustration for so many years and for so many administrations. We also have to be open about this fact. I remember the first time I joined a ministerial meeting, it was Ministers of Defense when my country, North Macedonia, was still not part of the alliance. But we did support NATO in Afghanistan and in Iraq previously. So we were there around the table discussing Afghanistan, but at every meeting, the Secretary of Defense from the US would start by calling European allies and Canada to invest more in their defense. Yeah. And some European colleagues saying, yes, we agree, but we cannot do it now. And this has been going on for too long. I remember some people were quoting JFK in '63, talking more or less about the same frustration from the other side of the Atlantic, that countries which are moving forward in terms of economy, in terms of capacities, are not willing to in a way, finance appropriately and invest in their security. So we have approached this problem in The Hague in a very pragmatic way. How can we do better? How can we invest in the trust by saying that European allies and Canada are doing more? And there is a clear sense, and I would say even understanding and consensus among all allies, that we will continue to develop, you called it previously European pillar of NATO, European defense within NATO, and this balance sharing, actually balance shifting, will strengthen the alliance. It will not weaken it. And of course, allowing US to be present in other theaters, but also saying that US nuclear deterrent remains also very important for the alliance, apropos the discussions that we have had previously.
Yeah, I think it was Donald Tusk who said it's not fair that 500 million Europeans are asking 300 million Americans to defend them against 140 million Russians.
You're absolutely.
And I think it's time to step up.
Yeah. And I think he added also, from an economy the size of Italy.
Yeah.
So both in terms of numbers, in terms of economy, might, innovation, power of industry, you know, it's, we can do better, and we can deter by investing even more in our security.
It's talking about in NATO now, burden shifting instead of burden sharing. What's the difference between the two terms? Does burden shifting somehow indicate that some downsizing or even withdrawal of American troops in Europe? Or, burden shifting has been on the table for many decades.
Well, this is it. When you don't deal with burden shifting, you know, then you have to be even more ambitious afterwards. It is clear that European allies and Canada, and European allies especially on the continent, are prepared to take the lead when it comes to conventional deterrence. And this means more prominent role, bigger numbers, but also capabilities. And this is where our relationship with defense industry become crucial. I started this morning in Oslo with a conversation with representatives from the Norwegian defense industry. Really remarkable, not just the primes, but really small and medium companies who bring something to the table. And they said that they have seen the demand signal growing stronger after The Hague, but they also need some additional predictability. Why is this that defense industry still with certain question marks? That's because they're afraid. Is our commitment real, and will it stay? Because we have had commitments in the past, and unfortunately, too many allies we were dragging our feet. So I think what was very important in The Hague was to send this message, and then what is important is that now we focus on implementation. Because it's not as if the 5% is something that we have on the table. The 5% is goal. Some countries are more ambitious. Some countries have already shown, you know, that they can contribute 5% either this year, next year, or until 2030. And I have to also say Norway was a very strong ally in terms of having the 2% even before many of the others. But we have to convince also defense industry and our adversaries that our commitment is not going to disappear the moment, especially the moment after the war in Ukraine ends. Because it is a clear understanding by all our intelligence services, by all our experts, that when the war stops in Ukraine, the threat of Russia will not disappear. On the contrary, they have shown that aggression will be and will continue to be their foreign policy towards practically all their neighbors. And we have seen this when we analyze Russian economy, when we see how they're churning up military equipment. So this is why our commitment cannot be a one-time decision. It has to be a sustained effort that will strengthen us.
Totally agree. You mentioned the need for NATO to step up in the Arctic. To a Norwegian and a Finn, the Arctic is part of our DNA, Prime Minister Stoere and President Alexander Stubb wrote in Financial Times, I think it was last week. And in the last year, the NATO profile in the Arctic is already enhanced due to updated regional plans and command structure, as well as Finnish and Swedish NATO membership. So what more could you do, or should NATO do, without diverting critical resources from other key priorities, as Ukraine?
Well, you're absolutely right that for you, Arctic was never too high or too north.
We live there.
And we have always counted on Norway to be our eyes and ears when it comes to this region. But it is true that there was hesitation, you know, on behalf of even Arctic nations, on how should NATO be involved. It was predominantly seen more as a national exercise, national responsibility. This thinking has changed. And what we have seen because of Russian presence, because of Russian activities there, is that we have to be more united and we have to have a more coordinated response there. 7 out of 8 Arctic nations in the world are NATO allies.
Exactly.
So it is our, front yard in a way. And what is necessary, of course, is for us to have not only more knowledge, more situational awareness, but also more presence and more capabilities. And the whole concept of the Hague commitment is not to move our capabilities around, but to increase and strengthen our capabilities. What was different was that even in our defense planning cycle, we had to adjust to looking at Arctic and Arctic capabilities as part of our planning. And the fact that now these countries are part of Norfolk Joint Command responsibility will be extremely helpful. But the idea is not to weaken our defenses elsewhere, but actually to bring more capabilities to the table, and it's definitely capabilities that you don't need elsewhere. I mean, these are all more specialized capabilities, more specialized military exercises, and this is why actually our Arctic allies are a huge resource. Living and fighting in this environment is a completely different ballgame, I was told. And after walking in Oslo, which is probably a very, very mild version of this, I can understand.
Yes, almost no snow these days.
Yes.
But we have to end by talking a little bit about the agenda for the upcoming Ankara summit of NATO this summer. The allies will meet again, and will it be assessment of how far you have, we have reached the commitments from Hague? What other topics will be on the agenda, do you know?
The Secretary General, when we were preparing for The Hague, he was very clear, not only in the discussions about the summit, but even discussions referring to NATO internal reorganizations. His goal, and maybe this is his Prime Minister's experience speaking, is we have to focus on our core business.
Yeah.
And it was an additional argument for him also to advocate stronger cooperation with the EU. Why? Because there are areas in which EU is actually better positioned with more know-how, and we shouldn't just repeat what they know better. So it should really be a cooperation. But NATO has to focus on what we know best, and probably we are the only ones with the DNA and the history and the experiences, good and bad, of actually command and control, defining military capability and conducting operations. So he said even then, we will not pick our 3 priorities for The Hague and then think about different priorities next year. No, it's all about implementation and delivering on these commitments, because the 5% pledge is only as good as our budget decisions are every year. If we don't follow up, they will actually become a vulnerability. On defense production, we will continue also the focus in Ankara, and we will have another industry day focusing very much on how can we support industry and how can we be better with using additional funds, but hopefully without avoiding additional costs. Because there were several ministers, I remember in the preparation to the summit, who said, if we increase spending, we will just end up with more inflation. So this is why our message to allies was, let's do more joint procurements, let's try to cooperate more, and let's insist on more innovative solutions in looking for the right capability targets. So this will also be high on the agenda. And the third element, this is what we do every day. I mean, we push allies to do even more on supporting Ukraine. And we just had 2 very important NAC sessions focusing on how can we support Ukraine so that they can really negotiate with more assurances and more strength on their side. And trust me, especially on issues such as air defenses, the situation is and was dire. Yeah. And this is something where I cannot avoid mentioning again Norway. The fact that you were able to use also your defense industry to support, but you were also, I think, a leader in terms of supporting financial package for the so-called prioritized Ukraine requirement list, which basically delivered ammunition and air defenses to Ukraine as we speak. So very quickly, this saved lives. It saved lives on the battlefield. It saved lives in Ukrainian cities. And we know that the focus now is on the peace process. But we also know that we have to continue with this support, because as you could see even today, the fighting has not stopped. And the attacks, especially on civilian and energy infrastructure, have only picked up. So these three things will be our focus as we head towards Ankara as well.
Thank you so much for a very inspiring and interesting conversation.
Thank you for the invitation.
And good luck with your important task to keep us safe.
Thank you.
It's great, very nice.
Thank you.
So we will now have a short break, 15 minutes, so a leg stretch, before we go back and listen to an expert panel on the MAGA world order. Please be back in 15 minutes.
For the next panel, the MAGA World Order and Consequences for the Transatlantic Partnership, please welcome on stage Janne Haaland Matlari, professor at the University of Oslo and the Norwegian National Defence University College.
Thank you very much, and happy to be here. We're going to have a panel discussion on que faire, what is to be done, as Lenin entitled one of his pamphlets once, what is to be done now in Europe and European defense. The point of departure is, of course, the NATO alliance, 80 years transatlantic cooperation, and ups and downs, but certainly now with major questions. And I think we could say that the good scenario is transition, that we have a period where Europe really takes seriously conventional defense and perhaps also nuclear deterrence, where Europe fulfills the pledges, and where the guideline is the National Defense Strategy that was published by the Pentagon just some days ago, in which it is said that the US stays with NATO. There will be the critical support, but less support. Europe has to be able to deter Russia, which is no problem at all, according to the text in there. It's very optimistic. You have so many more citizens. You are so rich. Russia has a GDP of Spain, excuses to Spain. So this is the transition scenario whereby the US stays the course, SACEUR remains American, the whole sort of burden shifting is accomplished. But then there is, of course, a rupture scenario which is lurking behind this, in which the commander-in-chief, the president, decides to maybe do a second round of Greenland expansionism or some other venture which makes it imperative that Europeans say, no, we cannot abide by this, we cannot swallow this, we cannot pretend that nothing has happened. So we have to, in a way, consider not only burden shifting and planning with the US, we have to consider the commander-in-chief's whims, political whims. Sometimes I think it's akin to a political Tourette syndrome. Something just comes that is completely unexpected. So clearly we can't be naive in Europe and say everything will be plain sailing. So what I want my panel to comment on is exactly what should Europe do now? What strategy should Europe adopt? Because clearly one doesn't deter Russia by conferences, by good sort of rhetoric, by talk. Europe has not assumed responsibility for Ukraine, although it's 5 years into the war. And one could think perhaps that would be a natural thing for Europe to do. It's a war in the middle of Europe. Why hasn't Europe assumed responsibility for that? And there isn't any sort of visible leadership stepping forward, despite the fact that we have French-British leadership of the Coalition of the Willing, Ukraine, and we have a Northern European model, perhaps, of European NATO, as was alluded to by our Prime Minister. So I think we are, in a way, we're very good at discussing these issues. We are quite poor at taking action, and deterrence lies in deter of being frightened. So nobody's frightened of conference proceedings. So I want to invite my eminent panel to come to the rostrum and comment on this. What exactly should Europe be doing, and who should do it? Who can lead in Europe? It's not a multinational organization. It is in major capitals that have strategic ability. So my panel consists of Barbara Kuntz, senior researcher at SIPRI in Stockholm. Welcome, Barbara. And she is a new member of NATO. And then Kaja from the Center for Technology and Diplomacy at Purdue University. Please, welcome. And Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, former commanding general of the US Army in Europe. And then Andrew Michta, who is then unable to make the transition, so to speak, transatlantically because his plane was cancelled. So he is very sad about that, because Andrew is a regular at these conferences, and he's always a very valuable comments. So I have taken the liberty of finding some comments that he has just published. And I think I will just start by relating what Andrew would have presumably said had he been sitting here. At least it's his words. He says, "The row over Greenland was a US mistake that will carry with it a penalty as we move forward. That penalty will be a partial loss of trust." And of course, trust is the commodity of any alliance, the most precious commodity in any close alliance, he says. But this is also an opportunity for allies to talk frankly to each other, not in normative, but in geostrategic terms, because alliances are first and foremost about shared threats and shared national interests, with shared values serving as a functional reinforcer, but not a defining one. So that's also what the Prime Minister said. It's about interests, common interests, and common threat picture. And he says, for too long, the biggest European countries have enjoyed a vacation from history being realpolitik, of course. The sudden shock from the row over Greenland should finally wake them up from their complacency and help them realize that their security is deeply connected to the United States. So this is, he says, this is the transition, the benign scenario he envisions. National defense strategy says the same, as I mentioned. We in Europe will be the core of NATO's conventional deterrence and defense under the US strategic umbrella. So now Europeans need to do their best to set aside their bruised egos, stop overreacting to Donald Trump's unpalatable tactics, and remember their countries don't have a relationship with this or that US president or political party, but they have a national relationship with the United States of America. So that was sort of food for thought regarding making the transition scenario a reality, because it's really, I think, very much up to us, not only to Donald Trump. So, Ben, would you like to comment on these que faire, what is to be done?
Well, first of all, you have to acknowledge that there's a threat, that there's an enemy. And Russia is absolutely at war with Europe. Even if we don't acknowledge it or don't want to believe it or don't take it seriously, the Russians are absolutely at war with us. It sometimes is kind of described as hybrid warfare, but I think that's a terrible name. Hybrid doesn't sound very scary. You think of a hybrid car, it's almost kind of cute. So that will not inspire governments to action. I think gray zone maybe captures it a little bit better because governments are reluctant or unwilling to say, you know, I'm not sure that that really was a Russian ship that tore the cables out of the bottom of the Baltic Sea or between here and Svalbard, or I'm not really sure those are Russian drones that are flying and shutting down every airport in Europe. Who else is doing this? Maybe some teenagers are responsible outside some airports, but I think we're being very naive if we think that this is not the result of Russian influence and Russian design to cause us to lose trust in each other and also to distract us from supporting Ukraine, because that's what this is about. Mm-hmm. The Russians want us in all of our countries, I'm an American that lives in Germany, to please stop supporting Ukraine because those damn Russians are going to shut down Frankfurt Airport or Brussels Airport or Copenhagen Airport. And until we can act with some sort of, and I keep saying we, I'm talking about the alliance, but also all the countries of Europe and North America, until we can inflict consequences on the Russians for what they're doing, it is only going to continue. Every day, ships, end-of-life vessels, according to the EU's Special Envoy for Sanctions, end-of-life vessels loaded with Russian oil and gas are heading out through the Baltic Sea, past 7 or 8 EU and NATO countries. Mm-hmm. Almost never stopped. What are we scared of? You should be scared of one of these ships having a terrible accident and dumping hundreds of millions of liters of oil on your shore. That should worry you. Not to mention the fact that the money they get for that oil goes to pay for their war against Ukraine, which is why there are 4.5 million Ukrainian refugees in Europe now, and it will only get worse if Ukraine fails. So what should Europe be doing? Number one, help Ukraine. That's the best way to protect Europe, is make sure that Ukraine continues what it's doing so they can defeat Russia. The second thing, this is probably the only time I've ever agreed with my president, Europe absolutely can defend yourself. Please stop whining. I mean, you were Vikings, for God's sake. Why is there so much whinging about, if the U.S. leave, what are we going to do? Come on. I mean, seriously, Ukraine, with very little help, has stopped Russia for 12 years, not 4 years, Kate. 12 years this war has been going on. Ukraine has stopped them. What is Europe? Why are we so scared that, please don't let the U.S. leave? Please stand up to my president. Hold us accountable. Make us live up to our talking points. That's what you should be doing.
Thank you very much. We could notice that 450 ships from the Shadow Fleet has passed the Norwegian coast or sailed from the north, passing our long coast last year, and we have not boarded any of them. Now I see there's a policy of boarding that is developing in, I think, UK and US and so on. So there's a reinterpretation of the law, so to speak. It doesn't really need reinterpretation because if you're not innocent passage commercially, then there are many things you can do. So this is, I think, very opposite because we are attacked, whatever we call it, not hybrid, but we're attacked in this political warfare. That's what it is. And we are just quite reactive in this. So we're talking about conventional deterrence, but we're not trying to do anything by way of denial deterrence of these attacks, which could also lead to less of them. So what we're not doing, now we have something on what we're not doing. Mr. Rush, do you have something, some good advice for Europeans, what to do?
Well, I don't get into advising Europeans what to do. I'll tell you what we Americans think, and you guys can figure it out among yourselves.
Yeah.
But I would start by saying, first and foremost, that I had the privilege to be in Afghanistan for 2.5 or 3 years. And it was a privilege to be with NATO allies, and the NATO allies worked and fought with us as well as anybody else. I think that needed to be said. Anybody who said anything different is wrong. And so I think that's... But having said that, I couldn't agree more with Ben, and I'm not going to be getting here and telling what Europeans ought to do, but I think it's useful to better understand America. The title of this panel is the MAGA World Order. It's an interesting term. I often am asked in my country to sit on the woke European world order as a panelist and explain to them what it is. Both the terms are ludicrous, but it is important that we speak different languages and we caricature each other in different sort of situations. A lot more here, perhaps with probably a little more articulate and long-windedness. On our side, a little bit more short, brief, and perhaps crude. But it is important to understand at the moment, and I will follow up on what the Prime Minister said. I thought it was useful, and few of the early speakers. Interests rule. Always interests rule. Geography matters. It's an important part. NATO issues and transatlantic issues have been tough, and they need a lot of work. That hasn't changed, and nothing that is written in the National Security Strategy or the National Defense Strategy is anyway odds with any of that which was said earlier here. What we do have now, that there is a question, a two-part question I think is important. I don't see, and I do not, rupture is a word you guys use. We don't use it. If you love it and you want to use it, you know, maybe the wishes come true. It's certainly not the term that Americans use, and will not use it because we don't see it that way. But we are at the cusp of sort of certainly a transition of sorts in which the transatlantic language is dead and the new transatlantic language is needed. Transatlantic interests are so deep-rooted and so inextricable that you just cannot rip them apart. A simple part is, in this country, exactly what my good friend General here said, you have trouble calling Russia an enemy. You have trouble unifying against Russia. You have even greater trouble doing it against China. So do we, because of the inextricable nature, whether it be energy or business. That inextricable business nature that both of us have with China is about $1 or $2 trillion maximum. Among us, it's $7 trillion. So this notion that we are at a rupture or somehow we're going to wander away, it's just not feasible. And then you can talk about it at Davos and get good speeches. It was the most irresponsible speech I've heard from Mr. Carney. It was great that a lot of accolades came about it. So I think that is important. So we need to work on that particular deal, and that is very, very... We're certainly not an isolationist country. When President Trump came up, there's a whole discussion it'll be isolationist. This has been the most active foreign affairs president in his first 1 year than last 7 presidents put together, and he's still not done. So I think he'll continue to go. I would also suggest that I would say 2 things that does bother me personally. One, I believe very strongly in American exceptionalism. And American exceptionalism believed that we ought to be held to a higher standard. I never measured myself, this is how Norway acts, or this is how France acts, and this is how I should be acting. I always acted much better in an exalted manner and trusted in that way. That appears to be waning under the president, and that bothers me. And I think it is sad to some degree. But that does not mean that I act any different than any European. Any day, all day, I'll take it on. We all live in glass houses. The other element which is important is that the tariff issue, even though it may be a useful tool on occasion, both the great sort of frequency of it and the great sort of unpredictability of it, that does harm one of the greatest strengths of America, which is the predictable system of American economics. So those are two important sort of considerations. Having said that, we're in a discussion here, one of style and substance, and one should not be, as a good Danish foreign minister said, this is now how friends talk to friends, and it's true. A lot of the conversation may very well be unwarranted, unfair, unhelpful. But it's a little bit like me walking around and saying, hey, if I had the money, I'd change this rich house. The rich people don't have good taste. They should have made the house this way and that way. I ain't got the money. They got the money. They built the house. President Trump got elected. He got elected in a federal state because this is the way he talked and people related to him. It is what it is. He's elected president. He talks about it that way. But it is the interest, and you guys have to figure out where your core interests are and how hurt are you with a given length of language. You can do both. I'm not saying pick one or the other. It is very likely, more likely than not, that by the end of President Trump's term, that he may have pushed both America and most of its allies either almost at or closer to a 5% GDP defense budget. That would leave all alliances, both Indo-Pacific, North Atlantic, and Middle East, stronger than they are. That will lead all our alliances and our capacity stronger than it is. And that may reel into a more safer world. That is more likely than not. I'm not saying it's guaranteed. That would be best for everybody. Now, of course, there is a rather bitter medicine on the way. The polite way has been told not just by Kennedy, but actually all the way back from Eisenhower onwards. It didn't work. He's trying a different matter and he's going at it. But in that context, everything that was discussed earlier today, and which is an NSS and which is an NDS, and which my good friend, the General, just said, it is very, very consistent. The National Defense and National Security Strategy says that we think Europe should be able to have the conventional might to deter Russia. We, America, will remain as a critical allies and everything else. Nothing that says it abrogates it. That is where Europe ought to be. That's what it says. It takes Israel as a model ally, talks about again and again, and it wants other allies to be like Israel, to be able to carry the hammer as well they do. If the world after 4 years ended that way, we'd be in a better place than we are today. And I believe that, yes, transatlantic relationship, because of the inextricable nature, would be stronger. I apologize and am concerned about the bitter medicine that comes on the way. One last point on this, because it was mentioned here a lot, which is the high north and security and directly relevant to Norway. We are at the cusp, in both NSS and NDS, we do not talk enough about the high north or the Arctic. Now, this is an area that comes into all three priority theaters in both the documents. Our Western Hemisphere priority, it comes directly within that specter of our high north. It comes into Indo-Pacific. It goes up into the high north. And certainly, making Europe great or stronger comes in. So they all come together in the high north. And people like me and others are talking about that, hey, we have a good concept of free and open Indo-Pacific. Let's extend it to the high north, and having a free north, not only Arctic, but the really game changer that happened with Finland and Sweden coming to NATO. So now we have this NATO blanket of Arctic, Baltic countries working together in a free and open north, an extension of free and open Indo-Pacific. I think the opportunities are immense, and if there's an I'm happy to come back to it. But that's another very, very positive area of strong collaboration, very strong, building on not only the 4,000 Americans here, and just like the Prime Minister said, that even in this era, that would be a very rich way of going forward. So a lot of good to do. I think there are a lot of bitter medicine, but interest rules, geography matters, hard work at bay.
Thank you. That was very forceful and very interesting. And I think we should remember, you mentioned Eisenhower, who said in 1951 that if there are American soldiers in Europe in 10 years' time, this NATO experiment is sort of a fiasco. So not to urge the Americans to go back now, but this theme has been around for a long, long time. And of course, Europe has been able to dispense with hard power to a great extent, because there has been the NATO-EU sort of implicit working relationship. I think Europe is the only region of the world that is classified in a way as a security community where states trust each other so deeply that they couldn't envision war. I mean, we even don't trust the Swedes, which we historically haven't done. We built a fortress against Sweden in 1908, 3 years after we became independent from Sweden. So this is something to, in a way, Europe has been so fortunate for such a very long time, not having to think about interests and defense of national territory. But now we have a new member of NATO, Barbara, not personal member, but Sweden is a member. What are your comments on this?
Well, I have a lot of comments, and I'm fortunate enough I'm actually born NATO member, though not personal. I think what might be a good starting point for this conversation is the observation that Europe has traditionally been extremely bad at interpreting the United States and reading developments inside the United States. And the level of surprise we see in some quarters now is really an illustration for that. That said, it is also extremely difficult to predict where the United States is headed right now. But the starting point for any European analysis, I believe, has to be that uncertainty is the new normal. And that also means that hoping for the best is simply not a strategy, although I think that has implicitly been, in many European capitals at least, the strategy. What I also believe is fair to assume that Europe will simply not matter that much in the United States. That American presidents, American policymakers, and especially the American public, American voters, will simply not be that interested in Europe. And of course, if you're sort of an Atlanticist on the European side of this, you might also have a wrong impression from the outset, because I really do believe that sort of the emotional investment in this transatlantic relationship and the meaning that would ascribe to it was always higher on the European side of the Atlantic than it ever was on the American side. And I think this is a trend that will continue, and that also just the general interest in the United States will go down, because even if Trumpism is perhaps over in 3 years, I think it is also really important to understand, it's at least my personal conviction, that the reasons that led so many people to vote for Trump are structural in the United States and will not go away. And that a lot of this is really US domestic politics, and the question of whether there is a political force, be it the Democrats or some other force, that manages to address the issues that people really care about, and those are not foreign policy issues, and they're not linked to Europe. And I think Europe being less important in the United States is good and bad from a European vantage point. It is obviously good in the sense that I don't believe that this current narrative of the EU as the main enemy that needs to be destroyed and where all evil comes from. This is not going to fly, because again, I really don't see sort of the average American voter care so much about. The danger with this narrative is more like, what are European populists going to do with this, picking it up in European elections and so on. So in that sense, I do believe that this is a very dangerous narrative, but the danger comes from elsewhere. Imagine European populists with US tech bro money just sort of taking this into election campaigns. But I think in the US it's likely going to fail. But it is, of course, also bad news if Europe is just less important to the United States, because that means that happy transatlantic times are over. Now, whether they ever were as happy as some people would have is another question. It's been mentioned here already very many times this morning that burden-sharing debates are as old as NATO, but that also, for example, the US relationship with international law has been, well, depending on who you ask, not always as exemplary as you would perhaps want to have it. And of course, there will also be Atlanticists in the US in the future, as there are now. But there again, I think it is also easy to get a slightly skewed vision when you're in Europe, because of course the Americans who like to talk to the Europeans and to attend conferences like this one, well, they're not the hardcore anti-Europeanists. And so there's also this whole other group of American foreign policy thinkers. So what does that mean for Europe beyond all the concrete measures we're talking about here and investing in defense and so on? I think the key mindset change that this really requires for Europeans is understanding that dependence is not a strategy. And I think for many it has been. If you look back at all these discussions we've had here in Europe, European strategic autonomy, and in many ways, although it was never really framed that way, a lot of these debates were actually about causality behind US engagement in Europe. And you had those who argued that if we become too strong, then the Americans will withdraw because they don't like that, or they will not think that we need them anymore. And then, of course, you also had the others who said, yeah, but the stronger we are, the more interesting we are as an ally. But there was never an answer provided to that disagreement on what is it that keeps the American in. And, of course, the Americans have also not really been helpful in answering that question, because the messages have been very contradictory. Like, do more, be stronger, but don't strengthen your defense industry. Don't become too independent. Don't do this, don't do that. So it also sort of, the Europeans could never find an answer to these questions from Washington. And not what, if there is something positive coming out of the current situation, it's not much positive. But if at least the mindset shift in Europe could be that, well, don't wait for the Americans to answer these questions. Just define your interest and just sort of go way beyond just saying 5% is the solution. It's really a matter of mindset. It's a matter of strategic culture. Is don't bet on dependence to maintain the transatlantic relationship. And just to end on something a little more positive, I've always struggled to understand why dependence would be the one factor that keeps the relationship across the Atlantic strong. I mean, I maybe sound like a feminist marriage advisor, but aren't the best relationships the ones that both sides want to be in, and not one side is in because it doesn't have another choice? And so I think if that's where we can get sort of as a European mindset, then there's actually something positive that comes out of the MAGA world order.
Thank you. That was very refreshing. Very interesting. And I think if we take that as the point of departure, then in a way, is the French thinking about autonomy, which is of course went on from de Gaulle onwards, is that a model for achieving European sort of strategic culture? Because strategic culture is a term that is used in the literature quite a lot. One disagrees on how to define it, but it has to do with the willingness to take risk and ability to take risk. And the only two key states in Europe with some degree of strategic culture that is strong enough, I think, to have a global reach, also the French and the British with their nuclear weapons, and then, of course, German money coming in. And I think we heard about the coalition of the willing, able, like-minded, that is Northern Europe. British leadership, the Nordics, the Baltics, the Poles, the Poland as a major military power. I think this is the only feasible way of showing leadership, of going forward, is that key states decide to do so. And then, of course, with the NATO method, so to speak, in terms of how to do it militarily. But politically, there has to be the will in capitals, not consensus-based organizations. The EU would not be able to do much as long as there's unanimity with Hungary, with Slovakia, with other countries that may want to stop aiding Ukraine, for instance. So I think this is a question, what to do now, is who can do it. And how, in a way, does one address the needs on the ground? Conventional deterrence, fully capable to be had here in Europe, what does it require if we leave nuclear out of the question? FT had a very good article some days ago listing the enablers, the strategic enablers that only the US has for the moment. Can we acquire those and how quickly? That's the sort of question. And to keep this interest-based cooperation with the US, as you talked about, Barbara, not to not look at dependency, but look at our interests and how to arm up in order to defend those interests. Any comments on this?
In America, when you're on a panel with somebody and the other person goes, "My good friend," that means they disagree with every fucking thing that you just said. All right, so just to be clear, Kaja and I disagree on almost everything that we have said. I wish that in 3 years the alliance would be stronger. But when the President of the United States daily and his knucklehead, his Secretary of Defense, daily smash our allies, when they denigrate the sacrifice of allies, when the President publicly says we didn't really need them. Okay, first of all, how many thousands of Allied soldiers were killed or maimed or wounded in Afghanistan? Only because we were attacked. The only time that Article 5 was ever invoked. So I was sick to my stomach to hear that, having served in the middle of British, Canadian, Lithuanian, Australian, Dutch soldiers, Romanians all around me. It was sickening. What makes NATO successful? The reason the Soviet Union never attacked us in a conventional way, the Russians have never attacked us in a conventional way, is not because we have gazillions of dollars invested in equipment. It's because they always knew that we would all show up. The cohesion of the alliance was always the secret sauce. Not if you were 1.8 or 2.2 or 5 or whatever. We all knew that we could show up. One of the best Norwegian soldiers I've ever known, Hansen, when he was the chief of the army, I was here on a visit several years ago. I'm so old now, I can't even remember exactly when it was. But I said, Odin, what is the part of Norway? I was revealing my ignorance. What part of Norway is strategically the most important thing? Well, where do you focus? And of course, I immediately was thinking, well, obviously it's around Oslo. You got to protect the capital where most of the people are. He drew a little cartoon map of Norway and then a circle around the top 10% of your country. He said, that's it. I said, what? Nobody lives there. He said, if the Russians ever captured that part of Norway, it would change all the calculations for the North Atlantic. It would reduce Norway's ability to monitor Soviet subs, Russian subs, but also what's coming through the North Atlantic. If the Russians got control of that with anti-ship missiles, with air defense, and they could disrupt everything that we, the alliance, needed to be able to do to defend ourselves. So here's a Norwegian army guy explaining brilliant maritime strategy that was not for the benefit of Norway, it was for the benefit of the alliance. That is strategic thinking. That's how our alliance works. And then my last point, what we, the United States, need from allies is not for UK, please hurry up and get to 3.5% or 5 or whatever, or for Poland. By the way, Poland, Romania, already there. And what happened to them? The U.S. announced they're going to reduce presence in Romania. So don't believe that, throwing money at the feet of the U.S. president in hopes that he'll stay involved, that doesn't work. Just like groveling does not work. This famous tanker seizure that happened a few weeks ago, I was impressed. Little tiny helicopters landing on top of a Russian flag tanker in the North Atlantic. I don't even like flying over the Atlantic in a Lufthansa flight. Here these guys are in helicopters in the winter landing on top of a tanker. Oh. Okay, well, they didn't fly there from North Carolina. Oh. No, the U.S. Air Force, which is unmatched, I'll say that when it comes to transport, flew helicopters to our ally, the UK, where we have bases because our ally, the UK, allows us to land there, unloads helicopters, and then working with British Navy providing refueling capability for 2 American Navy ships that are based in Spain because our Spanish ally allows us to be there. And they came up, and that's where the helicopters then went to, and then went and seized the Russian tanker. Plus, 50% of the intelligence that we depend on does not come from American satellites. It comes from our allies, and not just the UK. So this is what the birdcage liner, known as the National Security Strategy, is doing to the most important thing that we have, our allies. Of course they piss me off, okay? Don't forget, France kicked NATO out back in the time of the Gahr. This has not been a rose garden, all right? Greece and Turkey are at each other's throat all the time. Great Britain and France very angry at the U.S. when we intervened in Suez. Germans extremely unhappy when we invaded Iraq. But we always managed to get through it because we had not just shared interests, Kaja. We had shared values. That's what I worry about.
Yeah, very well spoken. And I think the dilemma for Europe is exactly how to not only contain and deter Putin, but it's containing also Trump's sort of the commander-in-chief and then the fantastic military apparatus below him, which is commanded by him, but which behaves as normal in a wonderful way, in a way. The military cooperation with the US is excellent, continues to be so, while at the same time the man on the top has these incredible, I would say incredible statements, especially the one about allies. I had a son in Afghanistan, he might have fallen, and what would I have thought when I heard the US president say what he said? So this is the dilemma, how to keep the military cooperation intact while maybe containing or ignoring, I don't know what we should say, many of the statements and policy actions of the US president in the 3 years ahead. Because you said interest, Barbara, of course, if there's a new round about Greenland and sovereignty, then there will be a conflict. If there's a new stab at Canada's independence as a sovereign state, there will certainly be conflict because principles about these key issues really matter so much. Do you want to comment in the debate here?
Once again, I would agree with the importance of the alliance and its contribution with my good friend, the General. If I was sitting in my MAGA world, there would be another general who would go equally rightly say about how much America carries the burden and what happens the other side of it, which he would be right just like this general was. And I think both of them are right. Now the question still is, yes, there is hurt. It's palpable here and to my left and palpable in the room. But President Trump, again, you can go one way or the other. What can Europe do? He does appreciate, and he did appreciate by Hague and the 5% commitment. I mean, he said they didn't do it. He came out of it and said, I think they really care about it, and they are going to do it. God bless them. Yes, Romania but that is consistent with the idea that Romania can address with conventional weapons, and we will try to be more on the nuclear and the defense and the spy and the logistics side of it. So these things are not inconsistent. And yes, I think it's important to deal with it in a very importantly credible manner. Credibility of Europe is at stake, not only in Europe itself, but certainly in America and the rest of the world as well. We do work, I mean, values are important, but values oftentimes are more relevant in this discussion than they are in an electoral campaign or when hard facts are done. Interest do carry. They're two sides of the same coin. There is no reason to pitch one over the other, but interest matter. Interests are the reason why you have trouble. If values were so darn important, Ben's point should have been a really easy one, vis-a-vis calling just Russia an enemy. If your values are so damn important, it ought to be real easy to say China is an enemy. You can't, because your interests rule. So don't sit here and give me lectures about values and interests and other side around. So the question comes down on this particular point is, what are the interests and how do you deal with it? You deal with it like Ursula von der Leyen deals with it, in a much more sober, in a restrained. She knows what her points are. She knows what can hit America or not, and what it will cost Europe when he goes into a trade battle. Georgia Maloney knows it. Metz knows it. Kaja Kallas, a good friend, she knows it. The person who doesn't know it is bloody Macron. They've been playing around France first long before we got to the damn game. So don't give me a break. And talking about strategic autonomy, I mean, you really want to have France and Germany be your backup for security on the worst day of Trump? The worst day of Trump? And you want to trade that to France and Germany? If you want, go for it. So the question is, let's just have a little. Mr. Carney comes around and says, we're going to have a rupture. Mr. Carney, Mr. Europe said 5%. Mr. Trudeau said, I'm going to meet 2% in 2032. You can't even have a laughable conversation on that. We don't know. So if you really are a middle power that'll say, this is what I'm going to do, then if Canada was even remotely have one more frigate in the north, we may have a different discussion on Greenland. So very important when all this discussion of alliances, this and what, whether it meets 5%, whether you can get conventional or not, it'd be very important that every time Europe speaks, it speaks in a credible manner so people like me and others come around and say, hey, Europe can deliver. There is a broad, and she's right, it is a broad, not just a Trump world, a MAGA world, or which are other world in the democratic world, similarly, that Europe is talk and cannot deliver. You have to change that narrative. That narrative has to be, and I pick one country for that. If you want to take one country that stands in abject counter to that argument, is damn Finns. They're one of the only people I know who talk less and deliver more. You know, and so the rest of this, you just have a conversation, we ought to be doing more. And so you got to be in a situation that says, here's my conventional deterrence to Russia. I can make it. Let's talk about, can we have a continued idea on nuclear? Do I really need nuclear? Because I really cannot, because even America is having trouble trying to update our nuclear arsenal because the cost is pretty darn high. Yeah. For you guys to come, or you have trouble doing 5%. I don't know when you're going to meet 5%. For you to talk any of the stuff you're talking here, you're talking 10, 15%. You go down 10, 15% discussion, you can kiss social state welfare out. I mean, you know, the whole great Norway living around free and happy. So there are so many issues here. You got to speak in a more credible way. God bless Ursula, Georgia Maloney. It's very funny. The people who are the most sober-minded in Europe are the European ladies. The ones who are most temperamental up and down are the European men who come around and tell us about strategic autonomy. I want him to give a strategic autonomy speech in down Beijing. He gives it to me in Moscow. We give him a strategic autonomy speech giving, and same thing with the Indians. Now, back to the interest point is very important. With the Indians, we have now a absolute tariff pitch with 50%. That has not hindered our defense and technology cooperation. It's moving, because the interests are so much aligned, that they are moving in a side track on this issue. So credibility, deliverance, I think conventional deterrence in your capacity, deliver it, change the tone, and I think you will find not only under MAGA Trump, but let's say what happens after Trump. We're not going to go back, even if there's a Democratic or Republic, we're not going to go back. This sustainment of this 5%, the commitment, they will stay. We can be in a good place. Let's talk about interest, which does not in any way preclude the value of the values, but let's start with interest so we get a more, just like was talked about, more sound, more balanced, more sustainable alliance as we go forward, and a stronger one for it. Firmly believe in it. That's why I came here.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's clearly the term interest was also mentioned very strongly by the Prime Minister, that it's not about, it's about interest. And of course, interests, we have this long debate about what's the limit of an interest. Of course, values terms of sovereignty as a principle and the key issues of international law and so on, our interests, especially for smaller, middle-sized powers.
I just want to make one point. I had Indians,
yeah, but
they are now the global south.
Please,
the global south people, the Indians come up here. You know what Indians say in the Raisina dialogue? When I go to Europe, I come back with value fatigue.
Well, but I think that's not really true. I mean, it's clearly the sort of safeguarding the free world was a major interest throughout the Cold War and throughout NATO's history. So I think it's the interest and the values conflate in defending territory, which is not only the border, but it is the way of life. It is democracy, what we stand for, our way of life. That is, the Norwegian army says, for alt vi og alt vi har, for what we have, but also what we are. But Barbara, we have suddenly three Americans here discussing what Europeans should do. Maybe that's symptomatic.
It is complicated, and I mean, I'm trying to sort of find the right segue into this. Of course, being credible as Europeans is important. The question is, credible in whose eyes? Is it sort of, does our deterrence have to be credible in Moscow's eyes, or do we have to be credible in Washington's eyes, but then credible to do what exactly? So, I mean, there's a lot that needs to be sort of taken apart and looked at very closely. When it comes to the question of whether European countries would prefer to depend on the US rather than France and Germany, I think the answer is obvious. Everybody would prefer the US. Now, the question is, what if the US they are dependent on is a US that threatens to invade Greenland, is a US that threatens to start a major war in the Middle East, and what have you? And this is, I think, the point where, as Europeans, you get to a point where your interest is simply not to depend on the United States again. And I mean, that is the question we're discussing here, is can we trust the United States to be reasonable in the future? And I mean, extrapolations are always difficult. So, but I mean, looking at the current US administration, my personal take is I think I prefer to be dependent on Paris and France, with Paris and Berlin, with all the flaws this has. And I mean, this brings me back to, since you mentioned European strategic autonomy, we don't call it like that anymore because that's toxic. We now talk about the European pillar of NATO, or as we heard this morning, Euro-NATO. It's exactly the same thing. Yeah. Just rebrand it. It works better. Okay, let's rebrand it. And just to defend my president here, the first pillar of strategic autonomy, understood sort of in the traditional French way, because the French version of strategic autonomy, sort of the notion is much older than the European version. And the first pillar is an independent capacity to analyze the international system, to understand what's going on in the world. And that is something I really, truly believe that Europeans need to attain to. Like all these discussions about capabilities, about 5% or 3.5 or whatever you have, they're all important. And there needs to be done more. There's no doubt about that. But sort of this intellectual dimension of being able to read the international system is something that Europeans, with certain exceptions, have really underinvested in, and that Europe needs to gain back. I mean, just to take a very recent example, Greenland, how many European capitals were even able to assess by themselves whether there is a Chinese or Russian threat to Greenland, or whether they should just buy the messages coming out of Washington, or what really is the situation? Now, not everybody is there, so involved in Arctic security, but there are plenty of other examples where most of Europe is just simply, I would say, unable to read the international system. And that, for example, also includes the whole nuclear dimension, which we didn't want to talk about here, but that, I mean, I don't know, I'm a political realist. I believe sort of in power structures, and of course the nuclear order is what's at the basis of this. So understanding the nuclear order is sort of really, really fundamental, and all of this has been, many countries at least, just outsourced to the United States to explain things to us, and they will manage, and we want them to be powerful and deter everybody else. So I think that there needs to be a lot of investment there. And again, I mean, I think this is really the fundamental misunderstanding and all these debates about European strategic autonomy. they're not about kicking out the United States. It's about a relationship on a more equal footing. And if the United States can't have that, well, then maybe you need to wonder if it's the right partner. But I also don't think that the US really is that opposed. If you sort of talk to the more reasonably people, I don't think it makes a lot of sense to have a European strategic autonomy debate with Donald Trump. So, I mean, there is a lot to be done, and there need to be a lot of investments on the European side that go way beyond the purely military dimension of buying planes and submarines and what have you, but to really sort of, start thinking about international relations again.
Yeah, I think that's very well spoken of, because we have a collective action problem, given the fact that we are so many small, medium-sized, and some few bigger states. But it's always the problem of who speaks for Europe, Henry Kissinger's famous question. But that has to be overcome. There has to be leadership and then coalition building around that leadership. And the E3, France, Britain, and Germany, are the three leaders, with Poland perhaps as the fourth leg on this. And this has, it strikes me that there's an urgent, this is urgent. It is not something for debates for ages. We really have to be able to reach an ability for conventional deterrence, at least, maybe also nuclear, as a continent, as a region. And it is very natural that we should be the primary actor regarding wars in our continent, for instance, Ukraine. We have now very little time left, because time flies when you're having fun. That was not President Trump, but President Reagan who said that. But we have about 35 seconds for each of you as a final comment.
Yeah.
Ben, I'm sure you
My
have
good friend Cash was dismissive of values. The Constitution of the United States, those are our values. And what I see happening day after day after day with this administration is smashing this. It is under real risk. And all of my European friends, while the favorite sport in Europe is not football or hockey or skiing, it's criticizing American policy. That's okay. It always has been that. But most Europeans at least always looked up to this, because it was a system based on values that you could trust. And I worry that we are losing that trust.
Once again, I would agree with my good general, other than, and in MAGA notion of building up our Constitution, I shall not, but I would agree very strongly that yes, but I believe in that Constitution and American public with my undying stuff, and I'm not made of that little metal that a 4-year term of a president elected fairly by America would diminish the American metal and what that thing is written on, far more than that paper. So I think the demise of our system or our values or our institutions are grossly overrated and certainly not to be discussed. Those are my own issue, and I'm 10 times more worried what's going on in Minneapolis than any damn thing in Arctic North. So I don't have to come here and brandish about my love or for the values. The important thing for Europe is that, very simply, America is strong with a strong Europe, and Europe cannot be strong without a strong America. That is the inherent interest on which these values are based. These values can't exist without it. And the fundamental element is, I can't be strong, I can't do high north without Norway, exactly for the reasons that mentioned here. That is really, really important. At the end of the day, that's what's important, that's what makes the world go around, and that'll continue to be. There's nothing under God-given earth that does not change that interest-based commitment. And so we are going to be together to strong, and 4 years from now, just like every other time there's a Republican president, you guys can snicker from poor Reagan to Bush, and you'll do this too. When you look in the hindsight mirror 4 years from now, we'll be stronger for it. And we'll go on to the next topic, and the next damn Republican president of the United States who doesn't know how to speak, and doesn't, if they can just went to the right school, they'll figure it out. But the future is strong, and I'm absolutely honored to be in Norway and talk about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Ladies last.
Thank you. No, I have to say I am deeply worried by what's going on in the United States, and I'm worried both by what the government is doing, but I'm also, and perhaps even more so, worried by what the opposition is not doing. And what that means, I believe, for Europeans is that you can't hope for the best. That is not a strategy. I would, of course, like the best to materialize, and then in 3 years we can all be friends again and everything is great again. But we need to be prepared for a different scenario, which is very possible. And so don't sit here and waste another 3 years discussing European strategic autonomy or whatever it's called now and not do anything. But prepare for the worst, hope for the best, but don't make that your strategy.
Thank you. On this very somber note, I have the... Thank you very much to the panel, and I have the pleasure to say that we can learn from the French that without good food there is no diplomacy. So there will be lunch. Water.
Okay, thank you for a very interesting discussion, I have to say.